So I'm very grateful to the Open University and to Exeter University for this opportunity for me to contextualise Anna. So many of you here knew Anna personally as colleagues or knew of her. And what you may not realise is in the audience with us are her son and her husband, her niece, her parents, friends, and me, her younger sister. And I thought maybe it would be a nice thing to do to help to give use, because given that Anna's work was all about children and creativity, that maybe it would be a nice thing to do to tell you what it was like to be her little sister. And so I knew her as how she was as a child. And Anna was 2 years older than me and would have been 57 this year. And my first sort of memories of Anna in this context, obviously I've got many memories, but I'm sharing with you some of the memories about her that may have most resonance for you. I can remember her going to school and me suddenly having no playmate anymore because she was 2 years older than me, and suddenly it was hours and hours on my own. So what she used to do is she'd come home from school and teach me everything that she'd learnt. So it then meant that when I got to school, I then knew how to read, I knew all sorts of things and I couldn't, these were just it seemed sort of natural to me. This is me and Anna at about that age. So Anna is 4 here, and I'm 2. And this was taken in Ormskirk, where we were both born. When I was ill, Anna used to be worried about me being bored silly at home, so she used to make me little books out of paper, and she'd staple them together, and there would be puzzles and dot to dot and things for me to do, so I wouldn't get bored at home all day. This was at this sort of age. She also was just full of ideas, which is probably no surprise to you, of things that we could do. So Blue Peter was a great show at that time, and she was very into it. And at one time, they were very into pipe cleaners. So there's lots of sort of nods in the audience, but I think they used to encourage us to make pipe cleaner dolls. Well, not content with making pipe cleaner dolls, Anna made pipe cleaner dolls and houses, complete with furniture, not just 1 but 3. And this is us she's 10 here, in 1971. So Anna was always able to think herself creatively around something, often subverting things. And this is Anna in age 15, revising for her O-levels. And later on, I remember about 10 years ago, I'm a doctor, but I was doing a PGCE in medical education. And knowing this was Anna's field, and also my parents, I was having dinner with her, and I had been given a task at the end of the PGCE, which was to deliver a teaching session to a group. Now, my role as a doctor, using my teaching skills, is to teach a trainee doctor, so it's 1-to-1. So I didn't think this assessment was fit for purpose, and I was complaining about this over dinner to Anna. And so, why am I being asked to teach to a group when actually I'm only going to be using this to teach 1-to-1? So she thought for a minute, and then she said, well, I know, why not? Why don't you teach on teaching 1-to-1? That could be your exercise. So therefore, I did a teaching session to my little group that was assessed on teaching to an individual, which I thought was a brilliant idea. And as a result of that, I got a distinction in that little bit as a result of entirely Anna's help. I also am full of frustration that I am now doing a lot of things in my world which Anna also was doing in her world, and I don't have the opportunity to discuss those things with her. However, she's still there, and there was a good example of this recently. I was supervising a group of doctors on this PGCE about 2 years ago, and I was being asked to teach about supervision in a medical context. And I was talking to my mum on the phone about this and saying, I'm quite sure how I'm going to teach this concept of supervision. And she said, well, you know, Anna wrote some stuff about this in relation to teachers, don't you? And I said, no, I didn't realise that, because, of course, as a sibling, we didn't discuss work so much as other stuff. So she said, yes, hang on a minute, I'll just go and look it up. I'll just go and look it up and I'll ring you back. So this says a lot about my mum. So half an hour later, she'd read the book and rang me back with about 10 quotes. And I was then able to, in this group of doctors, to be able to quote my sister and bring her into the present day, bring her live into the room, and also sort of show that it was interprofessional. So it was lovely. Anna lives on in all kinds of ways. My daughter Tash, who's also here, has set up a blog called What If, inspired by Anna. And my daughter's involved in the world of theatre and performance. And this is an opportunity to think about possibility in the world of theatre and performance. Anna did think of herself, when asked to think of herself as a sort of metaphor for who she was as almost like an animal, she thought of herself as a bee, like a really busy bee, pollinating all over the place, so dropping her ideas all over the place. And so sort of spending, as many of us knew, she was with us, incredibly present with us when she was with us, but she was also with lots of other people incredibly present, so in little drops all over the place. I think the last thing I want to say is that as Anna reached the end of her life, she was thinking about how to kind of make sense of what was coming, and how to imagine, how to make peace with what was coming. And she had a conversation with a friend at that time about ideas, which were very important to her, obviously. And she realised that, of course, many of the ideas that you're studying, the books you're reading, those don't stop being present. They're still present when somebody isn't here. They go on and on and on. So in a sense, they're kind of timeless. And Anna realised that she could conceptualise herself as an idea, and that she found great comfort in the fact that, yes, if I'm an idea, then I'm never going to be gone. I'm never going to die, because I'm always going to be an idea for all of you, which I thought was very, I mean, she did it for herself, to reassure herself, but it was also very reassuring for us to know that she is always present. And I'm very grateful to the Open University and the Exeter University for allowing us to continue with both the pollination and the ideas. Incidentally, this book is the picture on the front. Well, I was very proud and honoured to be able to do the picture on the front. And this is a collection of her writings that was published posthumously, if anybody's interested. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Naomi. It's lovely to have you give us that sort of remembrance and introduction and bring Anna back into the room. And I hope you don't mind me saying this, but whenever I see you, you bring Anna back to me. Your mannerisms, everything about how you twitch and move, and I don't mean that in a funny way, but it's just brilliant because it brings Anna back, not just as an idea, but as a real person again, which is just lovely because we don't get to see you or Anna anymore. So, it's just lovely to have that. So thank you for being that presence just now. Okay, so we need to move on now to the actual lecture, which is going to be given by James Kaufman. James is a professor of educational psychology at the NEAG School of Education at the University of Connecticut. He's the author of, a bit like Anna, 45 plus books and several hundred papers. He's also the president of the American Creativity Association. He's won numerous awards. He's married and has 2 boys. And his oldest son's favourite toy was a gift from Anna. It was actually talking about this gift that made me think to discuss with Teresa bringing James in to do the memorial lecture this year. I met him for the first time in Geneva last year at the Creativity Week at the University of Geneva. And we just started to reminisce. He'd only met Anna once or twice, I think, and that was the thing that stuck in his mind, the gift that Anna had given his son. And he will talk about this at the end of the lecture as well, as part of his lecture. And as we were reminiscing, one of the things that struck me was that James has worked in a very similar field to Anna and the team of researchers in the UK, but in the US, there's a different language, there's a different set of rhetorics around it. We very rarely, weirdly, cross-reference each other's work, but we're talking about very similar things. And in starting to have that chat with James, he seemed like a very obvious next step. So last year we had Pat Cochran, very much sort of home-based. She was our first female memorial lecture giver, which was very important to Teresa and I. But stretching back overseas to that sort of American, more international perspective seemed like a very logical next step. So we've asked James to give the lecture this year. Obviously, he's not here in person. Unfortunately, our budget does not stretch to flying him over. That would be lovely. But we have the recorded lecture, which we will also make available, I think, via the Open University and Exeter websites. So if you give me a moment, I will hopefully hit play.
Hi, my name is James C. Kaufman, and it is my honor to be giving the Anna Kraft Memorial Lecture this year. Unfortunately, I'm not able to be there in person, so I am filming it, and this is actually in a little nook in my house, as if I was sitting and just chatting about creativity, which I do an embarrassingly large percentage of my life. Anna Kraft has been a huge influence on me. Her idea of possibility thinking, this concept of what can be, what might be, what if, moving beyond just the questions of what is. This was one of the main existing bits of theory and just conceptualization in creativity that helped Ron Beghetto and I form the 4 C's, particularly Mini-C. Her idea of creativity as being almost inextricably linked to social change has also been a huge influence on me in a lot of the work I've been doing the last 5-10 years. What I'll be talking about today is how, as creativity researchers, we need to use a little bit of possibility thinking on ourselves in our field. And to kind of think about how can we go beyond what is when we talk about why creativity is important. I got my PhD and studied creativity, and when you get your PhD, you're kind of in this glorious protective bubble where, of course, you're studying creativity, and of course it's interesting, and the people around you are also interested in creativity, and it's kind of this delightful time when it's all about knowledge and learning new things, and it's fun. It's a place of ideas. After I got my PhD, I was in my first job, and it was working for in industry, in the business sector. And I remember thinking that I'd figured out a way of how you could measure creativity. And I was incredibly excited, and I went to one of my supervisors and kind of burst into his office, and I said, "Can you believe it? I think I found out this way that we can measure creativity, and I don't think it'll be that expensive. I think it'll be similar to what we're already doing." And he looked at me and just said, "So?" And I looked at him. "What do you mean, so?" He just said, "So? So what? Why would you want to measure creativity?" And this was the first time I'd ever been asked that question, the first time I'd ever thought that question in my entire life. It was like saying, so why exactly are you bothering to breathe? I mean, do you really need that lungs and the oxygen stuff? I don't get it. And the same way, if you'd asked me to explain how anatomically we breathe, I was just as coherent. I just, it's creativity. It's creativity. And he kept looking at me, and he's like, "Isn't creativity really just error when you're trying to measure intelligence?" and other stuff like that. And I moved kind of back to academia, where you're still allowed to just enjoy studying things and asking questions. But his question stayed with me for a long time. In addition to teaching and doing research, I also try to spread the gospel of creativity to a lot of different people and a lot of types of groups. And probably the most common, as with many of us, is schools, whether it's superintendents or principals or talking to groups of teachers, and organizations, CEOs, bosses, talking to different departments. And it's a pretty relevant question in this case. About 3 years ago, I co-authored a study with Marie Forgiard where we looked at current papers in creativity, and we were interested in seeing how many of these papers addressed why creativity matters. We looked at a number of different variables. One thing we found was that about 3/4 of the papers on creativity really study what predicts creativity. So what are the environmental settings? What are the personality traits? What cognitive abilities end up making people or groups more or less creative? And this is an incredibly important topic. Of course, we should be studying it. It's incredibly important. But it left less than a quarter who were focusing on, well, okay, what does creativity predict? And of those papers, almost all of them focused on the same two basic concepts. Either they looked at creativity predicting positive educational outcomes, or they focused on creativity predicting positive work outcomes. And again, these are perfectly good things to study, and they're important. If we look at creativity and academic achievement or organizational achievement, there was a recent meta-analysis that found that if you look at how creativity is related to school achievement, such as GPA, grade point average, and they looked across over 100 studies, it came down to a relationship of about R equals 0.22. And this is similar to a different meta-analysis that found a relationship of about 0.17 with intelligence. And 0.22 is fine. A problem, though, is that if you look at meta-analysis of conscientiousness, so the personality factor of being organized, diligent, hardworking, knowing when deadlines are, this factor, it's found to relate as high as R of 0.43 with academic achievement. Similar-ish things are found with work outcomes, looking at conscientiousness, also looking at intellectual abilities, the same type of strong relationships with these variables than with creativity. And so the problem is that if you're talking to a principal, to a CEO, and they're asking you, well, why should I look at creativity? I mean, we can say, well, your students will do better or your workers will be more productive. But if they then ask, well, will this be more true than if I try to have my workers be more conscientious or try to hire workers who have very strong cognitive skills? The answer is, well, no. It will not be better. The odds are pretty good it won't be the same. The odds are decent it'll actually be not quite as good. Now, this is still looking at a fairly basic level. GPA is not the be-all, end-all of academic achievement, and indeed, GPA is a proxy for what you think people will do, and it's looking beyond that. Ideally, we're looking long-term, and if we think long-term, then absolutely, emphasizing creativity is going to help students and workers be more productive, be more accomplished, all sorts of stuff. But we don't really have the data on that. We don't have, certainly compared to the studies of, well, the various tests that we use. So one thing I've done is think of, well, what are other positive outcomes? What are other things that creativity might predict better than conscientiousness or intelligence or other things that are a little easier to measure and sometimes a little easier to encourage in people? One of the outcomes that I've focused on a lot is fairness and equity. One early way that I stumbled on this was when I was asked to write a chapter about creativity and non-biased testing. And I kind of got into this rabbit hole of information, and a lot of the studies were on American tests, but this also holds true for a lot of cognitive tests, that if you look at how people score on whether it's intelligence tests, but also standardized tests, such as in America it would be the SATs, the GREs, also the AP tests, there tend to be gender differences, not on IQ tests, which usually are designed picking items that don't show differences, but certainly on standardized tests in mathematics in America, women tend to score about half a standard deviation lower on test scores. If you look at math performance, they tend to outperform males. If you look at other individual difference factors, such as ethnicity or culture or socioeconomic status, you often find that on these tests there are differences, and that groups that are not underrepresented, that are in the majority culture, tend to receive lower scores than groups that are in the majority culture. And people debate this, people talk about this, people argue about it. The thing that people don't talk about as much is that if you look at creativity, and you look at creativity tests, you just don't find these differences. I mean, if you're looking at divergent thinking, men sometimes have a slight edge on figural, women have a slight edge on verbal, but it's inconsistent. Usually it's barely anything. Certainly over different studies it equals out. If you look at performance, so rated creative performance, you tend to find no differences. You often will find not only no differences, but sometimes groups that don't do quite as well on standardized tests or traditional measures sometimes actually even do a little bit better. If you look at self-assessments, then you certainly find no differences. And you often, again, will find that many people who do not have confidence in their ability to take an academic test do have confidence in their ability to be creative. And for the last more than 10 years, actually closer to 15 years, I've been doing studies about this and feeling like, why aren't people talking about this more? Why aren't people excited more that if we look at creativity, everybody has the same potential to be creative? I mean, some of it is that we don't like talking about differences in general. But what this does is that even besides individual differences, even besides groups, if we're trying to find which students should be accepted to colleges, should have access to scholarships or gifted programs, things like that, if we include measures of creativity, which some places do, but most don't, then in addition to having a measure that is less likely to show group differences, we're including more information. And that if this is all the stuff that we want to look at in terms of who should be getting into college or graduate school or a gifted program, we're really only looking at this. If you add in creativity, and ideally even more, you are approaching more of what you're actually looking for. And you're doing so in a way that will add a measure that is not showing differences, that does not vary by any group. Beyond this, there's been a bunch of absolutely fascinating research, and this is not by me, this is by a wide variety of other people, that creative people tend to be less likely to stereotype. Conversely, people who endorse stereotypes are more likely to not be creative, or in other words, less likely to be creative. If you get people to challenge stereotypes, or even just get people to think about competing ideas. So a lawyer who's also a hippie. If we, just doing that will increase creativity. Similarly, doing creative interventions can help tolerance and equity. And so it kind of goes both ways. Increasing equity or tolerance can increase creativity. Increasing creativity can help tolerance and equity. Why might this be the case? I mean, one thing I believe is that, I mean, creativity certainly is not inherently benevolent. I mean, with David and Arthur Cropley, I've developed the idea of malevolent creativity. Certainly, creativity can be used for terrible things. I mean, it's a tool. You can use it for good, you can use it for bad. But if you look at what is a creative person like, what are the personality factors, the attributes that go into being creative? I mean, it's being open to new experiences. It's being open to new ideas. It tends to be people who are more flexible, who are willing to consider competing ideas, who are willing to try to think of more possibilities. It's people who are more tolerant of ambiguity, who are able to accept that we don't know specifically what's going to happen. It's also related to the ability to take different perspectives, to see things from different perspectives. And of course, perspective taking was a huge component of Dr. Kraft's work. In addition to equity and fairness, the other thing that is of great interest to me is how creativity can be related to meaning. Meaning is its own field, like creativity. And many of us may have read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and he articulates 3 ways that you can achieve meaning in life. You know, one is by creating a work or doing an activity, and certainly that's fairly straightforwardly related to creativity. Another is through an experience or a personal connection. And the third, he argued, was the way in which people face inevitable suffering. Thankfully, most of us generally do not have to worry about inevitable suffering, although certainly that the ability to deal with that is a source of meaning. If we look at another meaning theorist, Robert J. Lifton, he looked at 5 different sources of meaning. One was having kids and passing genetic material on. One was embracing the vastness of the universe, the idea that your physical matter is always going to exist. Another is putting faith in spirituality or religion or a higher power. A fourth is believing that one's creativity, work, and mentorship will continue to outlive you. And the fifth is experiencing life to its fullest and engaging in optimal peak experiences. And all of this in part was to help towards this idea of symbolic immortality, which Robert J. Lifton writes about. I mean, if we think about it, we all know that we're going to die. Animals don't, generally. And yet we do. And yet most of us can come to terms with that and keep trying to live a life that has value and purpose and meaning. And one way is through this symbolic immortality. We can't be immortal, but we can have part of us symbolically stay immortal. I mean, the fact that right now I'm delivering the Anna Kraft Memorial Lecture, Anna Kraft's work lives on. Modern theories of meaning tend to focus on 3 dimensions. One is coherence. Do you understand why your life has evolved in the way it has? Can you understand and comprehend your past decisions, actions, and the consequences of these actions? The second dimension is significance. Does your life have value? Is it worth living? And the third dimension is purpose. Do you have specific goals for the future? Do you have things that drive you to keep going? In a recent paper, I tried to kind of outline this temporal model of creativity and meaning. We're mapping these three ideas onto many different ways that we can be creative and how creativity can be used to help find meaning in these ways. So if we think of creativity and coherence, this is looking backwards. This is the past. Can we come to terms with our past? I mean, one of the major aspects of creativity that can be helpful with this is the writing cure. So the work of James Pennebaker and many, many others looks at how if we engage in expressive writing at least 3 times a week, can be 20, 30 minutes or more a week, as long as there is a narrative in place, there are an astounding array of mental and physical benefits. And this has been studied in populations ranging from students to prisoners to patients struggling with illness. And the outcomes have ranged from physical health to mental health to pain levels to risk-taking behaviors. One of the big keys is a narrative, in that if we regularly write on a regular level, whether it's a fiction, whether it's writing about our lives, it takes all of our little thoughts and ideas and worries sometimes, and it's kind of like putting them all on coat hangers and cleaning up the closet of our mind. And by doing this, it evacuates space. It cleans up our brain, so to speak. And that gives us extra brain power where we can focus on whatever we want. It reduces cognitive load. And although Pennebaker's take is not necessarily on the creativity of it, this is creative writing. It's writing stories, telling stories. It's journaling. It's writing about our lives. It could be blogging. I mean, this is a creative activity that so many of us engage in. And if we do it regularly, it helps us come to terms with our lives, with the past of our lives, with making sense of it. There's also the idea of creativity and post-traumatic growth. Marie Forgiard and others have looked at how after there has been a terrible trauma, some people are able to not only survive, but to really grow and not just move on, but become a better person, better equipped to handle more challenges. And one thing that several studies have found is that one of the key determinants is creativity. Believing that you're creative, seeing yourself as a creative person makes you more likely to be able to withstand and even potentially eventually thrive after something that is very traumatic. There's also a lot of things later in life. So one way of leaving a legacy is, this can be theoretically any time, but particularly later in life, is to write a memoir or a narrative or a scrapbook. It doesn't need to be verbal. And if you're pro C or big C, this could be your swan song. This could be a great work for the ages. But if everybody else like us, this could be something that your family appreciates and loves, or your friends. Right now in my living room, I have 2 paintings by my grandmother, and I don't know if they're good or bad, but they remind me of her, and it makes me happy. And a part of her is still around and still part of my life. Another dimension is the idea of present, creativity in the present, or significance. And there are a lot of creative activities that can help this. As people may have already picked up when I said optimal experience, the idea of flow reflects this optional experience, this ability to engage in something. And flow is, of course, not always about creativity, but the ability to get lost in doing something that is often creative, and whether it's, writing or painting or conducting a science experiment or inventing or whatever mathematicians do. You can get into flow, and that experience, that flow is joyful. There's a reason why people create. It's fun. It's beautiful, and it is a way of reinforcing that, yeah, life is fun, life is enjoyable, life is good. There's also the idea of the museum effect, which Jeffrey Smith has done some great work on. When you walk into a museum, and he's looked at art museums, my guess is it would be true of many different museums, and you're asked about how you feel connected to other people. Usually you start off, about here, in the middle. If you're then asked again about halfway through, it shoots up. When you are in the midst of your visit, and in this case, this research, studying art and enjoying masterworks with other people, you feel closer to them. You feel this connection just from the aesthetic experience. And then as you go, it goes down a little bit, but it's still higher than when you walked in. It speaks to what I see as a larger ability of creativity to help us feel connected with other people. It's funny because there's a lot of work on terror management theory, which looks at how people feel about death and life by having them imagine death and to see, well, what do they do when they're thinking of something terrifying? And when you look at terror management theory and creativity, sometimes they find that people are less creative when thinking about their mortality. And they talk about how you want to be connected with the community. And this makes sense, but I would argue a lot of creativity does connect you to the community. And that even when you're not faced with death, which hopefully is most of the time, engaging in creative activities is this way of being part of the human species. Another example is in perspective taking, which I alluded to before, the ability to take on the perspective of another human being, to try to see what other people may be thinking or feeling or experiencing. This is the same type of exercise that can help creators, whether it's a writer, a painter, or a scientist trying to figure out what to study. As a psychologist and educator, I often engage in perspective taking to think about what is important, how can I get my class engaged, sometimes what should I study next. And of course, engaging in perspective taking also helps you feel connections, and it helps you understand and experience life. There's been a lot of work, in addition, by Ellen Winter and colleagues on how art therapy works, and that when we engage in making art, it improves our mood, it improves general well-being. What's fascinating is that if you compare art creation, doing it simply for the purpose of doing it, so art for its own sake, art to enjoy it, and you compare it to doing very emotional art where you're expressing yourself. Unlike writing, art works better when it's just art. Art makes you feel better because it's fun, and we enjoy art, and we focus a little less on whatever maybe has been upsetting us or is on our mind. And so if expressive writing can help with coherence, art therapy and just engaging in art can help with significance. It can help enjoyment. It can help, in a sense, distract us if something bad is going on in our life, and there's certainly something to be said for that. Finally, for significance, art participation. And a lot of this stuff is in older adults. they've done so many studies finding so much good stuff that art participation does. It's kind of amazing. So they've looked at singing show tunes and making art. Many people have proposed that other types of creative thinking would also work. There's been less study of it, but these help both in physical outcomes, cognitive outcomes, emotional outcomes, again, connectedness, all sorts of positive things that come from creativity. Finally, there's looking forward, the future, or symbolic immortality, purpose. So some of this, as I mentioned before, with significance, can be leaving a legacy. So for coherence, writing a memoir or something about your past is a way of keeping track of it and sorting it out. For purpose, for the future, it's when you're doing it with the intention of telling your story for future generations or current generations. And that it's a way that, again, your work can live on. And this isn't, again, it's not just true for Big C, and this also, I mean, so much of it is true for our careers. I mean, it may not be the reason why we do what we do, but a lot of our contributions, whether it's students that we've taught, whether it's paper we've written or talks we've given, these will be remembered. And if we're lucky, they'll be remembered by a number of people and for a while. There's also the idea of identity development, that many people who look at how we develop our identity and how we kind of become who we're going to become, that's a creative process all by itself, where the product is ourselves, in a sense, and discovery, figuring out who we are, what we want to do. Sometimes this can extend to career narratives with high school or college students, having them think about the future. This is often a very creative act, whether it's generating ideas, whether it's coming up with possibilities, whether it's in how it's presented. And again, it is reinforcing this idea of goals and purpose. Meaning and equity are the two things I'm focusing on, but to me it's just the beginning. As a creativity researcher, as all of us who study creativity or related areas, we need to use Anna Craft's possibility thinking on our own area. I mean, we can keep doing studies of things that go into creativity and how creativity can help school or work performance, and these are important. But what else can we look at? What else might creativity impact? What else can we study? What else can creativity predict? How else, in a time when resources are being cut everywhere, there tends in general to be a movement away from science, away from art, in a lot of the population. How can we figure out ways to not demonstrate to ourselves, because we know, but to demonstrate to other people that creativity has worth, has value, still is a part of the 21st century? As much of a buzzword as creativity is, it's something people may say they like, but they don't want to necessarily give time and resources to. And this is one reason why I think it's so important to think of all the different possible ways that creativity can help the world. One of my favorite examples of possibility thinking is in this toy. And this is my older son Jacob's toy. And it's a fun little, you press it, and they pop out like that. And my father-in-law would play with my son, and he taught him that these were missiles. And so all of us were playing with these and launching missiles at places, and as you can see, we lost one of them. This was a baby gift from Anna Craft. I had met her in Qatar. We were, along with two other people, we were giving a long symposium, and it was the first time I met her, instantly liked her, stayed in touch with her for the next 7 or 8 years. And my wife was pregnant then, and she came with me. And I remember that when Jacob was born, one of the first gifts we got came all the way from England. And it was this, and we still have it to this day. And Jacob's now 12, so he doesn't play with it as much, but he still loves it. Again, it's been my absolute honor to give this talk in her memory, and a toast to Dr. Anna Kraft. Thank you.